All right, welcome back to the JFK Assassination Audit video number 58. It's now 13 February. So I'm going to get into, instead of going off on these fake defectors, we'll eventually get into that. But I'm having a lot of fun touring around Mexico City here. So what we're going to do is continue with Mexico City and how the JFK assassination relates to that, and then other things involved in that. So I guess I'd start off with one of the most famous, in this episode I'm going to call Mexico City of Spies. So one of the most famous people that ended up in Mexico City was Leon Trotsky. Okay, now Leon Trotsky had been basically the head of the military in Russia and helped them win the revolution and beat the White Russians. Okay, when Lenin died, he became an obvious choice for being the leader of Russia. But there was another man named Stalin who also was competing with him that didn't want that to happen. And the way those things happen, is that you force out someone and try to kill them and things like that in these other countries. And this is what happened. So Leon Trotsky had to flee Russia. He ended up in Mexico City. Let me see if there's anything important to mention about him. Yeah, so let's see. It looks like he fled, expelled from the Soviet Union in February 1929. And after surviving multiple attempts on his life, Trotsky was assassinated August 1940 in Mexico City by Ramon Mercader, an agent of the NKVD. He was a Spanish communist. And, so he was a hired assassin. So in 1940, so this is not unheard of. I mean, this is what Putin does. Any rivals that Putin has out there, anybody that speaks out that's Russian, that speaks out against him, any competition to his power, he goes after them, whether they're in Russia or whether they're outside Russia. And you see this happening with Navalny. He's been poisoned and then put in prison. There are other people who spoke out against Putin that were murdered in London and assassinated in other cities around the world. That's the way they do regime change there, okay? But, all right, so let me see if there's anything else worth mentioning here. And yeah, there we go. So what happened is at the end of the war, close to the end of the war in, May of 1917, the Americans came into the war, The Tsar had been overthrown around this time, around April or so, right around the same time that the Americans entered the war. The Americans entered the war after repeated warnings to the Germans to stop unrestricted submarine warfare, which basically meant any ships that were going to England or their enemies like France and went into their ports, they were going to destroy them before they got there because they were bringing material aid to the enemy. So American ships were coming in and providing a large amount of weapons to the Allies, even though officially the Americans were neutral. So the Germans considered they were a co-belligerent, and that, and any ships they had were bringing weapons that were going to be used against them. So they warned the Americans to stop doing this. And so they started attacking American ships. Americans warned them, Woodrow Wilson warned them not to attack the ships. They did anyway. So eventually the Americans entered the war in April 1917, right around the same time that the Tsar is overthrown in a nationalist type revolution, not Bolsheviks or communists, but a nationalist revolution. The communists are really good at least back then, because they're always the minority. They join up with revolutionary groups, whether socialists or nationalists or whatever, they ride along with that revolution, okay? And then once the popular revolution overthrows the greater threat, the enemy in charge, the dictator in charge, they stage a counter-revolution, okay, and overthrow the people that they were their allies to gain power. And so they let them do the most of the fighting against the dictator, or the czar, I guess you could say at this time. And then they stage, after they've worn each other out, then the communists would, the Bolsheviks would step in, and they would stage a counter-revolution, which is what they did, because the revolution happened like in April or so, and then they started a counter-revolution in October. So what happened is that the Germans, trying to destroy the Russian front, this is one reason why the revolution happened against the czars, because a lot of the soldiers were just not fighting. They were just giving up. They weren't getting proper ammunition and food and everything else. So they just gave up. They deserted. They had lots of deserters. They traveled back to the cities in Russia, and there, a lot of them, those soldiers, became the army of the Bolsheviks, or the revolutionaries. Okay, they formed Soviet committees, and basically overthrew the czar there. So to further the chaos, okay, the Germans, allowed for communists to travel through Germany on the way to Russia, okay, because how that old saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Okay, so anyone who's fighting my enemy, even though I may not agree with them and may arrest people like them in my own country, as long as they're the enemy of my enemy, I'm going to help them to overthrow my enemy. And this is what the Russians did. Matter of fact, they were so scared of Lenin that, because I think Lenin was in Switzerland, they sealed Lenin inside a train car, so no one could get in and get out. They were so scared of him. Trotsky, let's see, I think Trotsky was even in New York, I believe. Let's see. Hold on a second. Yeah. So Trotsky, let's see. Trotsky was in New York, and he stayed there. And there's also been some, people that try to put through that the communist revolution was actually financed by Wall Street. It wasn't. The British were afraid of him, and they arrested him in Halifax as he was traveling back to Europe. And then eventually he was released. And then he made his way to Russia. He organized, you have these ex-soldiers, and they formed these Soviet committees, but they weren't really a good organized fighting force. And so that's what Trotsky did. He organized the Red Army into a fighting force. I don't know if you've seen this movie, Dr. Zhivago, and there's this guy that travels around the country in an armored train that's all painted red and stuff. That's supposed to be Trotsky there, okay? But he was really good. He destroyed the White Russian army, forced out the Allies who had invaded in Vladivostok and in Archangel and places like that. And because before the war even ended, the Allies are trying to smother the revolution, okay, because they didn't want revolutions happening in their own country. But anyway, so eventually he gets really big in the military there, organizes the military, and then Trotsky, there were two types of Bolsheviks, okay, at the time, and Trotsky was an internationalist. He wanted to use the Red Army to further revolutions all across Europe and across the world, okay. Lenin was more of a consolidationist. He wanted to consolidate power in Russia and just stick within the borders of Russia or the Soviet Union at the time. And so there was this conflict between them. Eventually Stalin was able to gain enough power to force out Trotsky. Trotsky fled and went into exile. Eventually ends up, like I said, in Mexico City. And of course, when you see these fascists and Nazis talk about how, communism and Bolshevism was a Jewish plot, that it was all, controlled by, Jews at the top, and so you got this Nazi propaganda here, or even, this is actually Tsarist propaganda against the Jews, and that's because, a lot of the leaders of the communist movement were Jews. Not all of them, maybe 10%. But, what communism did is it freed Jews from serfdom, where they had to stay in one village and they couldn't leave and they belonged to that landlord, and it gave them upward mobility. At this time, the Jews in Russia and in the Eastern Europe were still in serfdom, okay? They weren't liberated like they were in Western Europe when Napoleon liberated the Jews and tore down the walls of the ghetto. So this is a typical communist or anti-communist, fascist, Nazi propaganda against Bolshevism, saying that, it's all run by the Jews, which is a bunch of bullcrap, because, Stalin wasn't a Jew. Matter of fact, Stalin persecuted Jews, and, he was paranoid that Jewish doctors are trying to kill him. If you go talk to any of the million Russian Jews in Israel, they'll tell you, they weren't allowed to go to synagogue, they weren't allowed to pray. If they listed that they were Jewish in the army, they were beaten up, or they were denied positions in the government. So communism wasn't a Jewish thing, okay, that, wasn't run or controlled by this cabal of Jews. Communism had more Jews in it than, they were allowed to participate in other groups, okay? But there was a big crackdown on Jews, especially during Stalin's days. Anyway, this is where, because Trotsky was a Jew from Ukraine, this is where they get this, they push this idea that communism was a Jewish plot. You'll see a lot of the Nazis, in the past, and the fascists in the past, and even nowadays, say the same kind of, push the same kind of BS. Anyway, so let's see. Trotsky gets thrown out. See, there's more, Bolshevik. This is actually Polish propaganda against, you see how they always make the Jew look like the devil. You see, he's got like pointed ears, the little eyebrows there, the little Ginsburg type goatee, So they try to make him look like, and you see how he's painted red. So they try to make this association between Jews and the devil and Satan, okay? Because you got a lot of ignorant village people running around in Europe and especially in Russia, and that just fits with their, they've never even seen any Jews, they don't even know any Jews, because most Jews weren't allowed to go into cities, so they wouldn't have any, connection with any Jews. So you could manipulate people by fear. Like I said, fear is the number one motivator for almost every human endeavor, okay? Again, but anyway, that's about Trotsky. So let's see, how does Trotsky end up in Mexico City? Yes, after Lenin died, he got thrown out. He actually created this united opposition, okay? There was the Comintern, which is basically an internationalist group of communists from China, from Vietnam, from France. They all came to Russia and trained and got money to go back and further their revolutions in their own countries. Stalin took that over, okay, and made it an anti-colonialist type campaign, okay, where they were going against the communists, the communists became the head nationalist leaders and anti-colonialists in their countries, so like in Africa and Asia, against the Western powers. And he figured that was the best way to weaken the West, was to weaken their, colonial endeavors. Anyway, let's see. Eventually, Stalin, you have these oppositionist leaders that are anti-Stalin. They're communists and they're anti-Stalinists. And so Stalin sends out his hits teams from his NKVD to eventually just kill off one by one all these people. Or he was the lead person there. Oh, it looks like he went to Turkey for a while. He went to France. He went to Norway. So how does he end up in Mexico? All right. So it looks like he arrived in Mexico January 1937. Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas. Now, don't forget, at this time, that Mexico had just fought a revolution. Okay? They've been fighting this revolution for like 10, 15 years. Remember, there's Pancho Villa and all that. Were chasing him around in Mexico in 1917 to 1920. So they fought this revolution for about 10, 15 years. And the revolutionaries who won were leftists. They were left-leaning. It was the party, matter of fact, the party that controlled Mexico for 50 years afterwards was the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. And they were in control for quite a long time. They were leftists, but they weren't communists. They were sympathetic to communists, sympathetic to leftists, and this doesn't work well for them because Wall Street bankers don't want to lend money and do business with people in Mexico that are pro-revolutionary. But let's see what else we got here. Yeah, and then there was these show trials in Moscow. They put, if I understand, they put Trotsky on trial in Moscow. But of course he wasn't there, In absentia, I think that's what they call it. And then Trotsky says, the Moscow trials are perpetuated under the banner of socialism. We will not concede this banner to the master of falsehoods. If our generation happens to be too weak to establish socialism on earth, we will hand the spotless banner down to our children. The struggle which is offering transcends by far the importance of the individual factions and parties. It is a struggle with the future of all mankind. It will be severe. It will be lengthy. Whoever seeks physical comfort and spiritual calm, let him step aside in a time of reaction. And just goes on and on and on. So one thing that Stalin was famous for is he would let these leaders, in Russia, in either the NKVD or the army or the Communist Party, they would go on, they would get really popular. They were doing their thing, trying to be the best they could be and try to be loyal to Stalin. But what Stalin did is anyone who became popular or threatened him by becoming popular, he would have them eliminated. So this set kind of a trend for like 20 years for people to not risk, not get noticed, not risk, becoming popular, things like that. So he had like the head of the NKVD, Dravetsky, he was murdered. The guy who murdered him was murdered eventually. And you have these long lists, and then he went after the top communist people who had all been loyal to Stalin. They'd fought in the revolution, and then eventually they were accused of being traitors to the revolution, So this is what he was doing. He was consolidating power, where he became the only person, just like Putin's doing. Putin's following the same exact course. He eliminates anybody who becomes popular that could threaten him. And this is what he's doing with Trotsky. Eventually, he does this with the military too. He just guts the officer corps of some of the best military minds that they had from the revolution and onwards. And this was a severe blow to the Russian military when Operation Barbarossa and the Germans invade. So Trotsky started the Fourth International, and what happens with people that are not in power, they always consolidate. They always not consolidate. They always end up arguing and bitter arguing with other people about other things. If you want to see some more about Trotsky, there's this really good movie called I can't remember the name. I can't remember the name now. It's about this famous Mexican painter, and I can't remember her name right now. But it shows the assassination there. So here's the assassination. It says, after a failed attempt to have Trotsky murdered in March 1939, Stalin assigned the overall organization of implementing the tasks to the NKVD officer Pavel Sudoplatov, who in turn co-opted Nahum Eltingen. According to Suplatov's special tasks, the NKVD proceeded to set up 3 NKVD agent networks to carry out the murder. These 3 networks were designed to operate entirely autonomously from the NKVD hero-established spy networks in the U.S. and Mexico. So what you do, if you already have spies in Mexico, they're sending in a separate group that doesn't know about that group, okay? Anyway, it says on 24 May 1940, Trotsky survived a raid on his villa by armed assassins led by the NKVD agent, I can't pronounce that, and painter David Alfaro Siqueiros. Trotsky's 14-year-old grandson, Esteban, was shot in the foot. A young assistant and bodyguard of Trotsky, Robert Harte, disappeared with the attackers and was later found murdered. I mean, they're really hardcore trying to get him. This is like the 3rd attack here. It is probable that he was an accomplice who granted them access to the villa. Trotsky's other guards fended off the attackers. Following the failed assassination attempt, Trotsky wrote an article titled "Stalin Seeks My Death," on which another assassination attempt was certain. On 20 August 1940, Trotsky was attacked in his study by Spanish-born NKVD agent Ramon Mercado, who used an ice axe as a weapon. Oh yeah, you've seen these ice axes? They use you hammer into the ice and you pull yourself up and climb the ice. Trotsky's last words were, "I will not survive this attack. Stalin has finally accomplished the task he attempted unsuccessfully before." Mercado was tried and convicted of murder and spent the next 20 years in a Mexican prison. Stalin wrote the assassin of Trotsky was a dangerous Trotskyist. This is why Mercado had no award initially. See, that's what Stalin does. He sends people out and then he cuts them off. Anyway. Ramon Mercado could not be either assassinated or freed from the prison by the Soviets. When he was released from jail in 1960, he arrived in the USSR. In 1961, Leonid Brezhnev signed a sentence to award Mercado the Order of Lenin, the Golden Star, and the title the Hero of the Soviet Union for a special deed. KG boss Alexander Selepin presented all these awards to Ramon in person. Anyway, so they have a museum dedicated to Trotsky. It's called the Museo Trotsky, and I've got the coordinates right here, and we're going to go take a look at it. All right, let's see. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on one second. Yeah, so there. We'll We'll get a street view. Hold on one second. Yeah, there's the museum. The walls, that is. Hold on a second. Looks like it's closed up. Is it closed up? Let's see, maybe we're on the side entrance there. I think that's it right there. Nope, that's not it. Hold on a second. Wow, there it is. Okay. Yeah, wow, it's still a pretty big museum there. So he lived there, what, 60, 80 years ago? Wow. And so he got pretty good little museum there going on. Huh. Interesting. Let's check out something else here. Hold on one second. And let's see, Russian Embassy. Let's see how far it is from the Russian Embassy, because the Russian Embassy is where they would have coordinated the attack. Okay. Oh, yeah. See, he's quite a ways. Well, not too far. 7.5 kilometers. 7.5 times 0.6. 4 miles. 5 miles. So he's not that far. He's within striking distance, and it worked. They got him. All right. Hold on one second. All right, so the next thing I want to go over, we're going to get into this eventually because I really like this section where we're going around Mexico City. Matter of fact, I'm probably going to have to take a little side trip to Mexico City. I've never been there, but it'll be interesting to go there and check it out. But so when Oswald, we're going to get into Oswald. I mean, we were doing the fake defectors, but I'm going to get into that later. But I want to get into what happens with Oswald in Mexico City, and the timeline's very interesting. But first of all, we want to check out where we're going. We already checked out the Russian embassy. We already checked out the Cuban embassy. Now we want to see where Oswald was staying and see how close that was to the Russian and the Cuban embassy. All right, so let's take a look here. So this is the hotel he was staying at in 1963. So it's interesting to check this out because there's a lady in Miami that reported to the FBI that she saw Oswald with Sylvia Duran, the employee at the Cuban embassy, here at a party with Oswald and a couple other Americanos. So it doesn't look to me like this place could hold any kind of party in any kind of dining hall. You see, there's not very much room there. So it's a very cramped space. I'm pretty certain that's the same building. I don't know why it's shaded there. Alright, so let's take a look and see how far it is from... Hold on one second. Alright, so here we go. So this is where Oswald's staying. And here's the Russian embassy. It's only like 5 kilometers there. So you're looking at, 5 times 0.6. About 3 miles. So Oswald could easily take a bus or cab or even walk there in 45 minutes. And then here's the Cuban embassy. So he's kind of in between, but over in a poorer section here. So, alright, so now we know the geography, because that's important. Alright, so hold on one second. Alright, so we're going to go down this list here and see what we can find. So, I always think it's important, the timeline, because you can really, really see what happens. If you put everything in order by dates, you can really get a clear idea of what's going on there. Okay? So we'll go back to New Orleans. We're just going to quickly go through these things. And, oh, let's see, we won't go that far back. But, so, what happens is Oswald's in New Orleans. He gets fired from the coffee company like July. So then he goes out and meets with these anti-Castro militants and go to the store, leave their manual saying, hey, I'm anti-Castro just like you, things like that. And then later on, he's spotted by these same Cuban militants about 4 days later on the 9th, passing out Fair Play for Cuba leaflets. So he's saying that now I'm pro-Castro. Okay? So Carlos Bernier doesn't like this. They get in a fight. Oswald ends up in jail. I'm not sure if Carlos Bernier ends up in jail. But all this happens right there in front of the Trade Mart. Okay? So what do we have? So we don't have Oswald doing the same thing in Dallas, but now all of a sudden in New Orleans he's pro-Castro, passing out leaflets, getting into fights in streets, things like that. Pretty strange. It says even after that, on August 16th, he's passing out flyers again in front of the International Trade Mart. Oh, that's when he's arrested. He's arrested. Out of that, he ends up on a radio station explaining what he's trying to do, what Fair Play for Cuba is. Now remember, he's a made-up member of Fair Play for Cuba. He's written them, but they haven't made him a member yet. Okay? So they're aware of him, and of course the FBI is aware of him too, because they're monitoring the Fair Play for Cuba in New York. So what's Oswald doing? He's got fired from his job. He has no money, but he's paying guys with him to go pass out flyers for this Fair Play for Cuba committee. It's a very strange situation. Okay? So after he gets on his radio debate with Carlos Bernier and his TV debate or TV interview, literally within days after that, that's when he starts getting ready to go to Cuba, go to Mexico. I do find it interesting that within days after him being on the radio broadcast, that Kerry Thornley, who's this guy that lived in New Orleans the summer before Oswald, who also was in the Marines with Oswald, who also wrote a book about Oswald, like 1961-62, before the assassination, okay, called Idle Warriors. This same Kerry Thornley ends up going to Mexico just like literally weeks before Oswald gets there, supposedly. Now, I am of the impression that Oswald was the person in Mexico. I think he was being sent again, like he went to Clinton, like again, his assignment was to pass out flyers. This was one of his assignments, okay? The reason I say that is because, if he wanted to get into the Soviet Union, he could just go back to Finland or go to Germany and get in the Soviet Union that way. There was no reason to go to Cuba. The only reason to go to Cuba or go to Mexico to try to get into Cuba, to get into Russia, that's like very strange. The only reason to do that is to be spotted, okay? So then that makes you out to be a communist, you're pro-Castro, and then when you're accused of, and caught and accused of trying to kill the president, then they can paint that back to Castro, okay? They can paint that back to the Soviet Union, and then the anti-Castro people, in the CIA, the FBI, and the military can try to force the new president into invading Cuba. They're going to get the maximum effect. Not only are they getting rid of Kennedy, they're going to try to turn that into an anti-Castro invasion by the U.S. military. Okay, because the anti-Castro Cubans can't seem to get it taken care of. So again, like I said, why would Oswald go to Mexico to get a visa to get into Cuba to transit to Soviet Union when he could just go directly, to Finland like he did last time, or go directly, to East Germany or anywhere else to get straight into the Soviet Union? I mean, going to Mexico and then to Cuba is kind of an odd way to get there. Okay. And again, it lays the assassination plot at the foot of Castro. Okay. And we're going to see here some statements that are brought out by Castro also about that. So Kerry Thornley is possibly going to Mexico to set the groundwork. Okay, I'm going to go into Kerry Thornley later about who he was and who I think he was doing. And I mean, definitely Garrison definitely strongly thought that Kerry Thornley was involved in the assassination, was, imitating Oswald when Oswald was in the Soviet Union, imitating Oswald when Oswald would, in other places. I mean, he lived in New Orleans. He lived literally across or around the corner from Clay Shaw, who was, shuttling Oswald around, sheep dipping him in New Orleans. So you've got this other guy, Kerry Thornley, that knew Oswald, looked like Oswald, could talk like Oswald, acted like Oswald, and also spoke Spanish. Okay? Oswald doesn't speak Spanish. Okay? Oswald only speaks Russian. But the Oswald that goes to Cuba, that goes to Mexico City, is recorded on the telephones speaking Spanish pretty well, and speaking broken Russian. Okay? So that just tells you that someone else was imitating Oswald. Now, right around this same time, within days after Thornley goes to Mexico, okay, Castro gives an interview where he tells the Associated Press reporter Dan Harker that the United States was assisting terrorist plans to eliminate Cuban leaders. He added warning to the statement, maintaining that if this continued, U.S. leaders could find their own lives in jeopardy. Now, the CIA and the anti-Castro people used this statement quite a bit to try to lay the blame of the assassination at Castro's feet. But again, you got to think about Castro, okay? Whereas the choice between facing Kennedy or facing, Johnson, the preferred candidate to face would be Kennedy. Okay, Kennedy was shutting down the anti-Castro operations. He tried to fund them in the beginning, but then he realized what was happening is that either they weren't working, or the people who were supposed to be trying to attempt to overthrow Castro, were using the money and the weapons and the means to do other nefarious things besides trying to eliminate Castro. And they were also pretty bad at it too. Kennedy also realized that the CIA was enlisting the mafia to try to overthrow Castro, and here Kennedy didn't want to be associated with assisting the mafia because on one hand they're trying to eliminate Castro, and on the other hand his brother is trying to go after the mafia and put them, the same people that are trying to kill Castro, to put them in jail. Okay? So Kennedy realized it was a lose-lose situation. He'd also assured Khrushchev a year before that they wouldn't invade Cuba, okay, if they withdrew their nuclear weapons. Now, maybe Kennedy knew or had an instinct that it came out later that, the medium-range missiles were removed from Cuba, but the tactical nukes and the artillery nukes, the Russians had handed over to the Cubans, and they were still there. So if we had invaded Cuba, okay, they would have used those nuclear weapons against our troops on the beach. And this is, again, I'm sure that in briefings, this is what Johnson came across, and he realized that shit. That's why he went to Warren and said, look, if you don't just narrow it down just to Lee Oswald, and you do any more expanding, opening more doors, you're going to find out that was anti-Castro Cubans involved, okay? And there are other people involved. But what he did is he switched it and made it that Castro was involved. And then that would force the United... And then he told Warren, he said, hey, I mean, Johnson knew it was anti-Castro Cubans and right-wing elements of the CIA and right-wing elements of the military. But he switched it for Warren to let him know that, hey, it's actually Castro is involved. If the people find out that Castro is involved, they're going to force my hand to invade Cuba. And Johnson was well aware there were still nuclear weapons there, and that could lead to nuclear confrontation again. And he pressures Warren into doing this commission, to narrowing it down just to Oswald. You know, so you have these right-wing elements in the CIA, the FBI, and the military. They're trying to push. They're trying to get rid of Kennedy. That's one thing. Connect it to Oswald. Connect Oswald to the Cubans. And how you can do this, how you can make these connections, you can go back and see what they're doing ahead of the assassination. Okay, so in September, a good October, November, 2 months before, they're trying to connect Oswald. And see, Oswald doesn't realize that he's going to be left as a patsy, which is exactly what he said. I'm just a patsy. Okay? But in September, Oswald doesn't realize this. He's just a soldier. Okay? He's following orders. Here, what we're going to do, they could have lied to him. They could have told him anything. But we want you to go down and disrupt, pretend like you're trying to get into Russia, trying to get into Cuba, and we want to see the communications from that disruption. Go in there and act like you're crazy, and we want to see who they communicate with, and that way we can confirm who's in control and where the decision-making is going on and how they communicate with each other. Okay? That's all they had to tell him. So he goes down there, because you think about it, it's September. Oswald got fired in July. All he's living off is like his $25, $30 a week unemployment. Okay? Another reason, I'm pretty damn sure that Oswald wasn't involved in the assassination and didn't know that he was being sheep-dipped to be a communist, is because Oswald's wife is pregnant. She's 8 months pregnant. Matter of fact, by the time he gets there, and I'll show you in the timeline, his wife has the baby within 2 weeks after he gets back to Dallas. So why would you be trying to get into Cuba, to get into Russia, to get out of the U.S., and you got a pregnant wife, you also got another daughter with your wife in the U.S.? It doesn't make any sense. Is he just going to abandon his wife? That's crazy, because he actually goes back and does all these things to try to get back together with his wife. So why, if you're going to kill the President of the United States, or you're trying to get into... I mean, again, it doesn't make any sense. If you're going to kill the President of the United States in 2 months, why would you try to get into Cuba, and why would you try to get into Russia, to go back there? If this is your grand scheme plan, if this is where they're painting him as, why, if you're going to kill the president in November, why would you try to get into Cuba, and why would you try to get into Russia to return there? It doesn't make any sense. You have to think about these things logically. Oswald is doing these things. He doesn't know what the grand scheme of plans are. All he knows is, here, this is your assignment. This is what you're getting paid for. Again, how does he afford this trip to Mexico and then back to Dallas when he has no money? He hasn't worked in 2 months. All he's getting is unemployment. Okay? It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, hold on one second. Now it says on 17 September 1963, okay, Oswald was issued a 15-day Mexican tourist card using the name Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay? Now that's not unusual. A lot of people don't understand the forms because maybe it's in Spanish. So maybe he put his last name first and then his first name last. Who knows? Who knows? Anyway, in the line with him also is a CIA former CIA contractor agent by the name of George Gadet. Okay, I've seen the video on the men who killed Kennedy of him saying, yeah, I was in that line, and I don't know, how my name got on that list and how I ended up in the line with him, but I never saw Oswald. That's bullshit. What was happening is that George was handling Oswald. He was told George's assignment was to handle Oswald, take him to the Mexican consulate, show him what to do, help him out, okay? And then he also got a visa to go with Oswald to Mexico. So that shows you that there's a guiding hand from the CIA, not the whole CIA. Like I said, you've got elements, right-wing elements in the CIA, the FBI, and the military, okay, that are doing things that the upper echelons of the CIA would have no idea about, okay? There's departments within departments within departments. Like I said in my other videos, you remember, think about it. If you're working in an office and you got cubicles, and say like I worked in call centers, we had QA, we had the accounting department, we had the people who did management, we had people that paid the light bills, with finance, that did payroll. When I'm in the call center, in my section, matter of fact, we had different sections in the call center. We had 90 days past due, 120, 160, 180 past due. We didn't know what they were doing in the other sections. We didn't know what they were doing in QA. We didn't know what they were doing in the accounting department. Okay? They also had different sections. We handled credit card debts, and they had different sections that handled, home equity loans and collections for that. And there's a whole group of people involved in that. I didn't know what they were doing there unless I chatted with someone in the lunchroom. So it's the same thing in the CIA, but even more controlled. Matter of fact, the CIA even had a program that was designed to feed misinformation to other departments about what they were doing. Okay? So you could run a special operations department. Matter of fact, you would want to do that in the CIA, because what if you have moles? Or what if you suspect there are people that are moles that are reporting back or being blackmailed by the Russians? You're going to want to keep that compartmentalized with that information. If you're running a special project like Oswald, that's going to assassinate the president or be framed for assassinating the president, you don't want that information to get out and come back to you. And you're not going to leave damn memos about it and stuff like that. So they're going to use contract agents. They're going to use people like Shaw, and they're going to use people like George Gadet. Now, it's my understanding that George Gadet comes up again 5 years later in involvement with the RFK assassination. I'll have to do some more research on that, but it's my understanding that he was a handler for, Martin Luther King and the RFK assassination. Okay? And it's interesting to note that the guy who shot MLK, Martin Luther King, also spent a lot of time in Mexico. Okay? A lot of time in Mexico. And was even got plastic surgery done in Mexico. And Canada too. He was in Montreal quite a bit, which comes up with Shaw in the Kennedy assassination. And Ferry. Ferry was constantly flying to Shaw to Montreal. Alright, so let's take a look at this document here about Gadet. So what I try to do is stick to documents. I'm trying to get away from websites and discussion sites, and people can guess shit all damn day. I want to look at the hard evidence and the documents. So that's where I'm sticking most of my time, is looking at documents. Alright, so let's take a look at this one, see what it says. Alright, so this is from the House Assassination Committee document. It's involving George Gadet and Bernard Festerfald. and subjects of the CIA, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, Oswald. See how they all come up in the same topics here. All right, let's see. This is what, 3 pages? All right, so it says memo of conversation between George Cadet and Bernard Westerfeld at Waveland, Mississippi, May 13th, 1975. Cadet is 67 years old of age and in poor health, semi-retired, writes for a local newspaper during World War II. Okay, this is like a background on Cadet. Hold on one second. Okay, so it says, during World War II, Cadet worked as a secret agent in Latin America for the Nelson Rockefeller. Now, everybody knows Nelson Rockefeller's deeply involved with the foundation of the CIA and part of the CIA. Coordinator of Latin American affairs under FDR. Now see, back before the CIA came into existence in 1947, they would run intelligence, okay, to the State Department, through the embassies in other countries, and also through, like-minded people in the media. Okay, so you'd have people that own news media like Nelson Rockefeller and stuff like that, and they had newspapers that they either owned openly or secretly in Latin and Central America and South America. And then they would gather intelligence. I mean, you think about it. If you got a reporter that's interviewing a government official, the president of Argentina, the president of Brazil, some senator in Brazil, some military guy in Brazil, he can gather information and just say, hey, I'm a newsman, okay? And this is the way it was done. You wouldn't get any scrutiny, okay? Because you're a newsman, okay? And that's the way it works, and that's the way it works now, because you got a lot of the media people, okay, that are involved in intelligence, and they, through Operation Mockingbird, they're reporting back to the CIA. And you'll see this woman who interviews Oswald while he's in Moscow after he defected. She was definitely working for the CIA because she was notified by the U.S. Embassy in Moscow about him, and then she interviewed him. Anyway, it says commercial work, the CIA, da-da-da-da-da. All right, it says Gadot is a right-winger. Now, don't forget also that de Mohrenschildt, even though he was a geologist, was traveling the same places. Latin America, South America. He was friends with all these top leaders there, and that's what he was doing. So Gadet's kind of doing the same thing. Gadet is a right-winger, generally disliked JFK. Kept his CIA activities very secret, not even telling his wife. Only told FBI in 1963. So he was working for the CIA, even though he didn't tell anybody. He was telling everybody else he was working as a journalist. Okay? The Latin American newsletter cost $15 per week. Both the CIA and the KGB had excess of 20 subscriptions, which means that each of them subsidized Gadet to the tune of more than $15,000 annually. Wow. As to JFK's slaying, believes Warren report is a fairy story, which shall become completely unglued very soon. Believes anti-Castro forces involved. You see, even he's saying that. Personally believes that he had a right to hate JFK. Thinks plot was hatched soon after Bay of Pigs and came to fruition in 1963. So yeah, this is exactly what I've been saying. So again, you have different groups involved, and they got involved in at different stages. So the anti-Castro people, the mafia, maybe even some right-wing elements of the CIA were anti-JFK and wanted to get rid of him in the beginning of 1961 after the Bay of Pigs. It wasn't until the Cuban Missile Crisis that the more established people in the CIA, FBI, and the U.S. military got on board with the assassination. And that's when you start to see things moving with Oswald. Okay? All right. It says, as to having the Mexican travel permit serial next to Oswald's, Gadet explained that it was complete coincidence and that he never met Oswald. See, so when they're issuing these Mexican travel permits, okay, they're done by numbers. Each permit has a number, okay? And usually they're issued, the person in line, they get number 1, the next guy behind him gets number 2, the next guy gets number 3. Well, Oswald gets number 1 and Gadet gets number 2. So it couldn't just be coincidence. He's saying it's coincidence, but I think he was handling Oswald, being there to assist him in case he got lost or didn't know what he was doing. Okay? Now, again, that tells you there's pre-planning in this from elements of the CIA and from the government there. He backs and fills on whether he fills on whether he flew to Merida or Mexico City. What is more interesting is the fact that he was interviewed 3 times by the FBI about it. Before telling them anything, he checks with Bill, the CIA station chief in New Orleans. And that's maybe Bill, is that Bill Moxley? I can't remember his name. Who in turn checks with Langley. It is decided that Gadet should answer questions per Mexican trip, but nothing more, and the FBI promises to keep Gadet's name to itself and save his cover. Apparently they did so until 1972 when his name was inadvertently declassified. So, again, okay, even if Hoover wasn't involved, okay, they're still doing their job, and it's been so compartmentalized that even the FBI doesn't know exactly what's going on. So they're trying to figure it out. But once they do know, which they become aware of, they cover it up, okay, so as not to involve the CIA. Gadet says the FBI reported about him having reported on Ruby's buying paintings for Bornstein is a complete fabrication. He didn't know either Hornstein or Ruby, and he wouldn't volunteer the time of day to the FBI. And last week, the FBI has called and is going to re-interview Gadet for whom? I don't know the dating on this. This is from the HSC. So this is probably like 1975. Gadet says he's never met Oswald and that he only observed him upon occasion. Question mark on this. So when would he have observed Oswald? I mean, in the line? When he's standing behind him? And how would he remember that was Oswald later on? Anyway, hold on 1 second. So this is a very odd statement here. He says he never met Oswald and only observed him upon occasion. Now, upon occasion means a couple of times. Okay? He says, but then he says, in any event, he described him, Oswald, as a miserable little creature who would do anything for money. Believes he was being financed by someone. Most seriously doubts if he could have pulled off the rifle fire in Dealey Plaza, as Lee Harvey Oswald was a terrible, nervous, and disorganized. So if he didn't know him, how would he know that he was a miserable little whatever that would do anything for money, and that he was terribly disorganized? To me, what that says is somebody farmed off Oswald to this guy to watch him, to help him get his visa, and to help him in Mexico, or to watch over him in Mexico, okay? And not pal around with him, but just maybe follow him around, make sure he's sticking to his assignment, okay? And then, so what he's trying to do here is burn Oswald, saying, oh, he would do anything for money. Okay, but then he says, oh, he couldn't have pulled off, he would have done anything for money, but like shoot the president, but he couldn't, he wasn't organized and was a horrible shot. So, in a way, Gadet's saying that, hey, there's somebody else involved here besides Oswald. He says, believes Oswald worked both sides of the Cuban street, doesn't really admit knowing what he was up to, rumored to have an office in the building immediately across from the Trade Center, the street from the Trade Mart. Knew Lee Harvey Oswald went to Mexico by bus. Now, how would he know that? Okay, he was just in the line, supposedly with Oswald, to get the visa, but how would he know that Oswald was got there by bus? Anyway, Gadot described the CIA setup in New Orleans in detail. Large offices with approximately blank people, similarly to the CIA setup in all ports, unmarked office, unlisted phone number. So what he's describing is the CIA has an office, operations office, they're running, and then they have a sub-office in Guy Bannister's office, which they're running the Cubans out of, and they're running the other operations. This is to build deniability. It's New Orleans office headed by Bill, lawyer, prominent family, debutante daughter. Bill is blank and office is blank. So I'm wondering if Bill is that lawyer that Dean Andrews is working for and that guy David Ferry is working for. CIA New Orleans had closed circuit to Langley. Now, does that mean direct cameras or does that mean close connections? Anyway, CIA only paid Gadot special travel expenses when their tasks couldn't be done on his regular trips. Gadot was once flown to Langley to brief CIA on Latin American affairs. So what you see here is that Gadot is a hired contractor. He's not a farm-trained CIA agent. Just like DeMornshield, just like Bannister and Ferry, he's a contractor. You're putting people out like this there that have deniability, okay? And then the right-wing elements of the CIA can just stand back and cut off all ties, and they can say, hey, it wasn't us, and hang these guys out to dry. And you hear the tone in Gadot, that kind of bitterness about the CIA, because they hung him out to dry. Last, when he thinks of Rockefeller as head of the commission to study either CIA or Dallas. You see, this is 1975. There was the Rockefeller Commission before that was in charge of researching the illegalities of the CIA, and he laughs about that because he knows that Rockefeller's in with the CIA. It's like, what do they say? It's like the fox investigating the hen house. I mean, it's not going to happen. Anyway, he says Ferry knew Lee Harvey Oswald and Shaw. Now, how would he know that if he doesn't know Oswald? But Shaw wasn't CIA and had nothing to do with Dallas. So it's been proven that Shaw was CIA. But why would Shaw share that with Gadot? Wouldn't make any sense. Thinks E. Howard Hunt knows more about Dallas than any other person he can think of. Hunt was God to the Cubans, and he is certain that CIA sent Hunt out immediately after Dallas to see what he could find out about the Cuban connection. So how would Gadot know all this shit if he didn't know all these people? Okay? You can't know these specific things that other people wouldn't know unless you were having communications with those people. Interesting. Knows Lee Harvey Oswald's cousin, Marilyn Moret, in an intelligence connection. Now, Marilyn Moret supposedly had intelligence connections, therefore, you've got these connections. Now, let's not forget that Lee Harvey Oswald stayed with Miss Moret, or maybe her mother, I believe, first thing he did when he came to New Orleans, before he got his own place. Says Sergio Acacia Smith should be cross-examined if alive and subpoenable. Okay? Now remember, Sergio Acacia Smith was the person that Oswald got in the fight with. Okay? Again, this is all, I think that was all staged. It was all part of sheep-dipping Oswald, just like Garrison says, to make him look like this pro-Castro communist. Okay? Anyway, so you get a lot of good information from these documents. Let's see, what else do we have here? Hold on one second. Okay, so like I said, I don't like to go on the websites, I don't like to go on the discussion groups. They've got good information, but you want to stick to the original sources. Okay, and all these documents that are being released are original sources. FBI, CIA, House Assassinations Committee, all those, they've got the good shit, okay? So you know, I don't know how to describe this. We're not going to ever find any documents out there from the CIA, the FBI, any agency, the military, the Cubans. There's not going to be any monitoring of or tapes. They're going to catch people saying, yeah, we did it. It was me and him and so. We did it on this date. We planned it here and da-da-da. And the money came from this guy. You're never going to find those documents. Never. Because first of all, they never would have been stupid enough to produce documents like that. I mean, think about it. If you're going to commit a crime, are you going to document that? You're going to write down on this day in a diary, on this day we decided to rob this bank, and on this day we cased the bank, and on this day we found out their routine for the armored car, and on this day we went and bought guns, and it was me, Joe, and John that bought the guns at this store at this address. Nobody, no criminal is going to commit a crime, is going to document or write that shit down. Okay? But how they get caught, okay, is they're texting each other, they're emailing each other, maybe they get caught on tape talking about the crime or coding about the crime or whatever. And that's how, maybe the FBI grabbed somebody and then we got you on tape, saying this was going to happen and you're going to go to jail, and they turn that witness, and that's how they convict the other guys. Okay? So you're never going to have anyone in the FBI or the CIA or the government, they're not going to find these documents because they either don't exist, or anything that comes close to showing that they do exist has been destroyed, either by the original perpetrators or the people who found out about it in the FBI and the CIA later on. Because I guarantee you, the CIA and the FBI did their own internal, even the military, did their own internal investigations to try to find out, was some of our guys involved, whether back after the Warren Commission or during the Warren Commission or years later. Okay? Or maybe you got some curious cats 10 years later that start investigating. And they're doing that not to cover up for the crime, but to protect the agency. Like I said, out of fear. Because the fear, if you're thinking the national security type mentality, the fear is that if it came out that the FBI or elements of the FBI or the CIA were involved in killing the President of the United States, the American people, Congress, lots of other opposing powers would call for the elimination of those people in the military, the FBI, the CIA, and even the dismantling of that agency itself. So if you've got people that are fearful that if that happened, that would make us blind and vulnerable to our enemies, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, whoever, they would want to prevent that from happening. That would be their motivation. A lot of people say, hey, a lot of these people are in their 80s. Why would they want to keep protecting these criminals who killed the president? That's the reason. Fear that if they went stripping through and tore up the place, it would make us blind to the Russians and the Chinese who take advantage of us. It would be 20, 30, 40, 50 years before we would recover. And God knows the damage that can be done to us in the U.S. and our intelligence apparatus by our enemies if you had someone going crusading through and just ripping up people and tearing up the agency. This is why they do that. There's not going to be any documents, okay? But like I said about a house and its foundation, the crime was the house, okay? The house has been burnt down. It's been destroyed, okay? You're never going to see that house again. You can rebuild it, but it's going to be a different house. It's not going to be the exact same house, okay? But from that house, there's going to be a foundation. A concrete foundation is usually all that survives when a house burns down. You're going to have cables coming in for internet, for gas lines, for electricity. You know, there's going to be connections there. There's going to be neighbors around that live near that house that say, yeah, I remember that house. I remember that place. You know, everybody has got grandparents and older relatives, and they talk to them, and yeah, you know, where this new mall's at, that's where my old school used to be before they tore it down. So they're going to remember that, even though it's not there anymore. There's going to be paperwork. There's going to be titles. There's going to be, you know, mortgage payments to the mortgage company. There's going to be a bank loan for the house. So there's going to be other paperwork like that that's around. And this is what we're finding. This is what we're finding in our, you know, NARA dumps, the National Archives. Okay, so you got people in the CIA and the FBI and the Secret Service and the military that are going through old files. Okay? Or they've been given requests by the National Archives or someone else to give up files. They're going through and they're looking and they're trying to see, you know, is any of this, if we release this, could it endanger anybody in the field? Okay? Now, I, on the hand, am very pro-CIA, FBI, Secret Service on not releasing certain documents, okay? Especially when it comes to names and operations that occurred, even in the 60s, okay? Because this is how it works. You set up an operation, even if it was back in the 60s, where the Russians, the Soviets, the Chinese at that time, didn't know they were being fed misinformation. So they went along that and built their structure, their intelligence structure, and their network based on that misinformation that was supplied to them. This is what, you know, Oswald is doing in Moscow and in Mexico City. Okay? Oswald's providing them fake information. He's shaking up their network so they can look and see how they react to that. Same thing in Moscow. That's what he's doing. He's going there, hopefully providing them with false information that he believes to be true. Okay? The Russians are reacting on that and comparing it to other fake defectors and other intelligence they have, and they're building their defenses based on that information. Okay? So if it comes out 40, 50 years later that all that was BS, the Russians are going to go back through and they're going to reevaluate the system they built to defend against that. And maybe even strip it down or tear it out or go after people that were involved in that. Okay? It's, you know, Russia, the Soviet Union was not against going into villages and destroying whole villages to shut down biological weapons that were released. So they're going to go in and tear out anything that they think is false in their intelligence system and anyone involved in that. Okay? And that means killing and torturing and putting people into, you know, into gulags and things like that. So this is what I think the CIA, the NSA, the intelligence operations were using Oswald initially, and that's what they're using him. And so what happens is this right-wing element of the military, CIA, FBI finds out about Oswald. And there's many Oswalds, believe me. There's Chicago, there's Tampa, there's Miami. Each one has its own Oswald. So eventually they settle on, at the last minute, this Oswald about August, September. Okay? See, while Oswald's being sheep-dipped, there's other people being sheep-dipped around the country. Because they don't know exactly where Kennedy's going to end up and where Kennedy's going to be speaking. Eventually they iron it out and they push for Dallas, because that becomes the big thing. Anyway, we'll keep going with this. So we'll go down this document here. And so what I'm saying is that we're going to find documents that give hints to this house that burnt down, that give tracking of movement of people and money and supplies that help us see the shadow of an operation that went on. Again, you've got a group within a agency, and that they're hiding from that agency from them finding out what they're doing. But they're using the apparatus of the agency to carry out their mission. So you may have 10,000 people involved in the intelligence community, between the CIA, the FBI, the DIA, the Secret Service, all these people. But you may only have 100, 200, 300 operators, 500 operators running around. Okay? And like I said, like you're in that office, you're in that cubicle, you're in that section. You don't know what's happening in the accounting department. Okay? Matter of fact, I'll tell you a story. I used to work, I think I mentioned this before, I used to work for this, I won't name this company, but I used to work for this company in Portland that was a mortgage servicer. Okay? So they had a bunch of clients, a bunch of people that had their own company, and they bought up all these FHA loans after the government sold them at auction. So basically what FHA is a program that if you get behind on your payments, you lose your job, whatever, you can go to the FHA, they'll put you in this program, and as long as you're working and you make like something like 6 months payments straight in a row, don't miss a payment, okay, they'll take what you're past due and put it at the end of your loan, and just like you never were past due before, okay? And then, as long as you make your payments, you'll be on their FHA program for a year or two, depending on your credit risk. And then what the government does, the FHA, is they have a private company, several private companies that are managing those payments, and then they sell off those packets of mortgages to different companies, and they get them at a discount. So if you got $10 million in mortgages, a company could come in and buy those 10 from the government for 5 or 8. You see? And it's a losing situation for the government. But anyway, it helps people stay in control there. So this company, and then those investors will look around for people to manage, these bundles of mortgages that they bought from the government. So Wilshire was one of these companies. I accidentally said the company. Anyway, it was Wilshire. Okay, I worked for Wilshire. I was the collection guy. Okay, I was the number one collection guy for the mortgages at Wilshire. And basically it was just really simple. I'd call in the morning, I'd call in the evening, and try to make payment arrangements. And, if you were one day late, I was calling you. And people would get upset about that, and I'd say, hey, you went into this FHA program agreeing to stay current, and now, you've been released to us, and it's no more games. The FHA, they're not going to take your house. It's called foreclosure. We can do that if you don't maintain, if you go 90 days past due, your house is mine, okay? And so every day I'm calling, I'm researching. A lot of these people's numbers get disconnected. I start immediately pulling their files, looking for all the contacts and phone numbers they had on their original applications. Start calling all those, talking to relatives, talking to employers. And I'm really good. I find everybody. Okay? And then, I'm talking to people, and after like 2 weeks, I contract to send out a guy to go take a picture. Make sure they're still there. Sometimes the pictures would come back, the whole place would be burnt down. There was a fire. But they never contacted us. They might have contacted their insurance company, but they or the insurance company never contacted us to let us know, so we're still going to process it like they're past due. Okay? Other times, people would have, 2, 3 Mercedes cars in the front. The house had been renovated and painted. I could also see they had a brand new pool put in, a brand new garage, additional little guest house in the back, and then they're sitting there telling me they can't afford to get caught up. Bullshit. And you see, the more information you have, the more power you have, the more you can mess with these people. So anyway, my whole point was that I was really good at collecting on these guys, okay? Now, this Wilshire, the way it was set up in about 5 or 6 different buildings. They had We had the collections and customer service in one building. We had like accounting and the technical and the documents section in another building. We had the management in another building. They also had another part of Wilshire called Beverly Hills Bank. And this is all run by this guy, owned by this guy. And so we didn't know what was going on in the management section. Well, apparently what happened, I worked there like a year, they had overextended themselves. They had, and what happens is you've got money coming in, you got money going out, okay? And your money coming in are these payments, okay? The mortgage payments. You want as many of those coming in as possible. Now, in Wilshire, typically, about 95% of the people were making payments on time, no problem. It was the other 5 or 10% that were having problems. About 5% were habitually past due, but eventually I would get them caught up. The other 5% were just burning the clock out until they went to foreclosure, which is another department that I had no idea what was going on over there. So, but what happened is there was some kind of financial crisis. Credit got really strict, and Wilshire wasn't able, on the months that they had, if I remember this correctly, less money coming in than money going out, because you have to pay your investors. Okay, you got to pay your employees, you got to pay your rent. You got to pay, your executives their bonuses and crap like that. You got to pay for, the owner had a big Mercedes. All the executives all had big Mercedes in these big mansions and all this kind of stuff. Matter of fact, this guy had one of the biggest mansions in Portland. When that was more than the money coming in, they had to go a credit line. Eventually, that credit line tightened up because they had like some kind of Asian financial crisis, and they weren't able to float over anymore. Okay? So the whole process was they were able to foreclose enough that they could sell the properties and flip it and make a difference, make a profit off that. Okay? So I would hammer them for 90 days. It would go to foreclosure for another 90 days, and then eventually it would, everybody's seen these, they have houses up for auction and mortgage. They would auction them off, and then, we would make the money off that. But that was another department, foreclosure. I didn't really handle it. So what was happening is that the CEO was actually found another way to get money to float them over during this financial crisis, and they were getting money through this investor company. It was basically a guy who had an office, and he would handle investments for different pension funds. This was like a couple of union pension funds and stuff. And so what that guy was doing was like the late fees that I would make, because they'd bring them past due, but they'd have to pay their late fees also. They would take the late fees and they would, take that money to invest in these pensions, and then they would get a return back. And it's very complicated. It was kind of a Ponzi scheme. So the unions, the head of the union investment, like all the unions would join up with this one company or guy that was going to invest their union for the pension fund and make them money and be able to pay the pension, have it keep growing, and be able to pay people while they were retired. So he was basically being bribed by the head of this investment company, was in cahoots with the president of the company of Wilshire. Okay, it's a scam, Ponzi scheme. So what they would do is the late fees that I would collect and the other people it was mostly me, because it was me and like 5 other guys in the collections department and mortgage, and that was it. And I was bringing in probably a third of everything. Okay, so it was mostly my fees that I was bringing in. And they would take that money and they would pay it back to the union as dividends. And this is where they got in trouble, because it was a Ponzi scheme. You weren't actually getting real, Wilshire would lose money, but then they would pay off the investors as long as as a interest return on their investment, and then they would induce them to keep investing. I didn't know any of this. I read all this like years and years later. But again, my point is that this is how it works in the CIA, the government. You've got different departments doing different things that other people may not even know anything about. Again, I didn't know any of this was going on. I didn't know that the CEOs would sit there in the conference room and listen to me make phone calls, and just hammer people, just hammer them, till people were crying. I was really gung-ho. I was a go-getter. And because I was making them their Ponzi scheme money, didn't have any idea, didn't know anything about this. I never interviewed with the FBI or anybody in the SEC or nothing like that. So, but I read about all this stuff later on, what was going on. But at the time, I had no idea what was going on. And so what I'm saying is that in the CIA, the FBI, and the Secret Service, and other intelligence agents of the military, there's the establishment group which make the rules that go along and have congressional oversight and all this kind of stuff. And then there's subgroups that violate the rules, but they don't let other people know. Even in their own organization, they're violating the rules. Okay? So it's not like McCone, the head of the CIA, was aware that the president of the United States was going to be assassinated before it happened. Okay, because there were subgroups and, rabbit holes that he wasn't allowed to go down. Even the CEO of a corporation may not know everything that's going on in his own corporation. Okay? And just like you can flip that to the bottom, the guys at the bottom can keep people from knowing what's happening above them. Especially with a loose organization like the FBI, the CIA, you're not being monitored as much as you would be in some call center like I was working. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about right-wing elements, Confederates, people that were of like mind in the military, the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, the Mafia, the anti-Castro Cubans, racist Klansmen, all these people, they all had their little groups and functions to carry out. Godot was one of these guys. He wasn't aware of everything, but we just read that he was aware of quite a bit, because all these guys are talking when they get together. Hey, did Oswald know this? Did Oswald know that? You see? So this is what's going on. It's very complicated. It's hard for people to understand that, but think about it, like I said, with your own family, your own company, whatever you're working in. You don't know everything that's going on with everyone in your family, your cousins, your grandparents, your brothers, your sisters, your immediate coworkers. You don't know everything that's going on with them. You don't know what they're involved with. How many times have we heard after some mass shooting, some people, best friend or teacher or someone that went to school with him says, "Oh, he was such a nice guy. He loved puppies. I can't believe he went and shot 20 people in a damn Walmart." How many times have we heard that? Because people, they hide. They hide who they are sometimes from what they're going to do and who they really are or what they feel about certain things. And they present their actors. Just like Tom Cruise plays a role, people play roles. They play good son or good daughter to their parents. They play good student to their teacher. They play best friend to their friends. Meanwhile, they're out in the woods torturing cats and shit like that. I mean, I'm just saying because that was one of the things that a couple of the people were caught doing. So you can play different roles. This is what's happening with these different agencies. But later on, like I said, when these agencies do their own house cleaning investigation, that's why they are still protecting the secrets, and they burnt all the documents or they destroyed the documents, because they don't want it coming back and destroying that agency. The number one rule is to protect your own ass. They're protecting their ass, they're protecting their agency. By protecting the agency, they're protecting their ass. That's what they're doing. Anyway, that's enough of that. Like I said, we'll get back into Godot. We'll keep going and go from New Orleans to Mexico City with Oswald and go to this. I was going to go through this later on after the assassination, but this is pretty fun. I actually like this section. I'm going to try to switch back and forth between the assassination witnesses, and then the Mexico City trip of Oswald, and then the fake defectors. But we'll see how this goes. All right, take care. Bye.